The words came out of my mouth before I knew I was going to say them. Glenn had the rifle up, barrel tracking left, and I was already stepping in front of him with my hand out, palm flat, the way you stop traffic. I said it loud enough for all three of them to hear, "Nobody shoot." And then I said the part that froze all of us solid. It's holding something. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Dale Birch. I was 37 years old in November of 1989, and I had been hunting the Clearwater country in north central Idaho every fall since I was 17. My father started me in those mountains, and his father started him, and by the time I stepped in front of Glenn Hobson's rifle on that ridge above the North Fork, I had logged over 200 days in that specific drainage. I knew every bench, every saddle, every elk trail that switched back down through the lodgepole pine to the creek bottoms. I knew which draws held elk in early November and which ones went cold once the snow came in hard. I knew this country the way I know the lines on my own hands. So when I tell you that what we found that morning was a situation I could not explain with anything I had ever seen or learned in all those years in the backcountry, I need you to understand the weight of that statement. I do not say such things easily. My father was a man named Lester Birch, and he drove log trucks and elk hunted and fixed things with his hands and told the truth even when it cost him. And he started taking me into those mountains when I was old enough to carry my own pack without slowing him down. That first trip was October of 1969, which would have made me 17, and we hiked in 6 miles on a trail that followed a drainage of the North Fork Clearwater that my father had been hunting since his own father showed it to him in the late 1940s. I was carrying a borrowed rifle, a 30-06 that had belonged to my grandfather, and I was trying to act like the weight of it and the weight of the pack and the elevation gain were not affecting me, and my father knew I was faking it and said nothing. That is what fathers who know what they are doing do in that situation. They let you fake it until you do not have to anymore. We made camp the first night at roughly 5,800 feet on a bench above a side drainage in a wall tent that my father and his friend Phil Dunlap had used for years. Phil was there that trip, a big, quiet man from Orofino who worked at the same mill my grandfather had worked at, and the three of us ate canned stew and talked around the wood stove, and I fell asleep listening to the two of them talk in the low, easy way that men talk when they have been friends long enough that the conversation is as much about the silence between the sentences as it is about the words. My father killed a 6-point bull elk that second morning before I had even gotten off the bench where we had watched the opening of the valley below. He did it at 240 yards on a downhill shot in heavy timber, which is a difficult shot by any standard, and he dressed the animal himself and taught me to help him quarter it while the meat was still steaming in the cold air and the ravens were already calling from the trees above us. I was 17 years old and I had never done anything like that before, and it changed me in ways I could not articulate then and can only partly articulate now. There is an honesty in that work that very little else in civilized life replicates. You are inside the actual consequence of what you did, and the responsibility of it is immediate and physical, and you understand that the mountain is not a stage set and the animals in it are not props. I killed my first elk on that same drainage the following year, a cow at 120 yards in the early morning, and I have been hunting that country for 52 years since, through my 20s when I was courting Joanne, and then newly married, and then a young father with two boys who needed things that cost money I did not always have. Through my 30s when the work at the shop was good and the boys were old enough to start coming with me on some trips. Through my 40s when my father started slowing down and eventually could not make the walk-in anymore, and I continued to go without him because he told me to, because he said the mountain does not care who is not there and you honor it by going. He died in 1996, my father, a stroke at 71, and I went into the Clearwater that November anyway, alone, and I sat on the bench where we had made that first camp 27 years earlier, and I watched the dawn come up over the ridge, and I understood that some places hold the people who have been in them, and that he was still there in a way that was not mystical or sentimental, but simply true. I tell you all of this because it is the frame around the story I am about to tell you. When I say I know that country, I do not mean I have a map of it or a GPS track of where I have walked. I mean I know it with the familiarity of your own house in the dark. I know where the ground is soft in May and where it is frozen in November. I know which faces catch the afternoon thermals and which ones go dead still at sunset. I know the sound of wind through old-growth Douglas fir versus second-growth lodgepole pine, and I know the sound of elk moving through both, and I know the sound of no animal moving at all. And when those sounds are absent in a place where they should not be absent, I know that too. I retired 3 years ago from 41 years as a diesel mechanic, 38 of them at the same shop in Orofino. Orofino sits on the Clearwater River in Clearwater County, about 40 miles east of Lewiston, and it is the kind of town where everybody knows what truck you drive and approximately what you had for breakfast. My wife, Joanne, has taught third grade at Orofino Elementary for 34 years. We raised two sons, Kevin and Daryl, in a house on the east edge of town with a wood stove and a gun safe and a chest freezer that ran off elk meat and garden vegetables 9 months out of the year. I tell you this, not to pad things out, but because the kind of man I am matters for the kind of story this is. I am not a man who sees things that are not there. I am not a man who mistakes a bare and dim light for something that walks on two legs. I spent 4 decades crawling under machinery in poor light, diagnosing problems by sound and feel and smell, and that kind of work teaches you to observe carefully and report accurately and not embellish what you found, because embellishment gets somebody hurt. What I am about to tell you is accurate, every detail exactly as it happened. I have sat on this story for over 34 years, and I am telling it now because 2 of the 3 men who were with me on that mountain have passed away, and the third, Glenn Hobson, called me last spring and said he thought we had held it long enough. Glenn is 79 years old, and his health is not what it was. And he said he did not want to leave this world with the story still locked up inside him. I agreed. So here it is. There were 4 of us that November, myself and Glenn, who had hunted together since our early 20s, and 2 brothers from Kamaya named Roy and Leroy Stites. Roy was 42, and Leroy was 38, both experienced hunters who knew the Clearwater drainage almost as well as Glenn and I did. We had hunted with the Stites brothers 3 or 4 times over the years, and they were the kind of men you want with you in rough country. Steady, quiet, capable of covering a lot of miles without complaint. Roy worked at the mill in Kamaya, and Leroy drove a log truck out of Pierce. Between the 4 of us, we probably had 130 years of elk hunting experience in those mountains. Glenn Hobson deserves more introduction than I have given him, because what happened on the bench and what Glenn did there is the core of the story, and it is easier to understand what he did if you understand who he was. Glenn grew up in Orofino, a year ahead of me in school, and we became friends in our early 20s over a shared predisposition toward engines and the outdoors and the kind of late-night conversations that young men have in the parking lots of bars when they are too young to know what they do not know. He is the best natural mechanic I have ever seen in 40 years of the trade, meaning he has the instinct for it, the ability to lay his hands on a machine that is not working and develop through touch and sound and smell alone an accurate hypothesis about what is wrong with it. This is a specific kind of intelligence that is not correlated with formal education and not developed in a classroom. It comes from paying attention, from being genuinely interested in how things work and what happens when they fail, and what the relationship is between the two. Glenn learned to hunt from his uncle, a man named Harvey Hobson, who worked the Forest Service out of Orofino for 31 years and who knew more about the Clearwater drainage than anyone I've ever met. Harvey took Glenn in starting at age 12, and by the time I met Glenn, he was already as comfortable in deep wilderness as most people are in their own living rooms. He reads terrain the way some people read books, picking up information in the landscape without appearing to look for it, knowing from the angle of shadows and the bend of grass stems and the way a bank of snow has settled into an old track, which direction the wind has been blowing and how long ago an animal passed. He taught me most of what I know about tracking that is worth knowing, and he did it without ever calling it teaching. What I did not know until later, until the trip back from the bench, was that Glenn had had an experience in that drainage 7 years earlier that he had not told me about. He had been hunting alone in October of 1982, camped at a lower elevation than our usual spot, and on the third morning he had found a set of tracks in fresh snow along the creek bottom that he had followed for 3 miles without arriving at any conclusion he was comfortable committing to. He had found similar tracks twice more in subsequent years, once in our drainage and once further east in the Loxa country, and each time he had followed them as far as the terrain allowed, and each time he had come back to camp without discussing what he had seen. He told me this in the truck because he said the bench had taken us past the point where not discussing it was a choice he could make in good conscience. He said, "Dale, I have been carrying this for 7 years, and I did not know what to do with it, and now I do." And I asked him what he was going to do with it, and he said the same thing you are. Carry it forward. But at least now we carry it together. We went in on the second day of the general season, November 11th, 1989. The plan was 8 days in the backcountry, camping in a wall tent at a spot Glenn and I had used for years, on a flat bench above a side drainage of the North Fork Clearwater at an elevation of roughly 5,900 feet. The access was a logging road that dead-ended about 4 miles from our camp, and from there it was pack-in country. We each had a frame pack loaded with 8 days of food and gear, and Glenn had the camp equipment distributed between all 4 packs. The walk-in took us the better part of a day, about 7 miles on rough trail with significant elevation gain in the last 2 miles. The Clearwater National Forest in that part of north-central Idaho is not easy terrain. The ridges come hard and fast, the timber is dense in the draws and opens up on the south-facing slopes where the sun keeps the snow from piling too deep, and the elk move constantly based on snow depth, hunting pressure, and temperature. You earn every animal you take out of that country because you earn every step getting in there. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness begins just south of the Clearwater National Forest boundary, and together they form one of the largest roadless wilderness complexes in the continental United States. That is not a figure of speech. There are places in that system where the nearest road is 40 miles in every direction, and if you walk straight north, you would not cross pavement until Canada. It is the kind of country where things can exist without ever being seen by the wrong eyes, and it always has been. The Clearwater drainage in particular has a quality that is hard to describe to people who have not hunted it. The old growth in the draws is genuine old growth, trees that were standing when Lewis and Clark came through and that have never been touched by a saw. Douglas fir with trunks 4 feet across at the base, western red cedar that you could hollow out and sleep inside with room for your pack. The understory beneath them is dark even at midday. Fern and devil's club and Oregon grape growing in the perpetual damp that exists where the canopy is thick enough to block most of the sky. When you are in the deep timber down in those draws and you look straight up, you see a ceiling of interlocked branches and needles that the sky comes through in fragments, and the light that reaches you is green and diffuse and ancient feeling, and the sounds, elk moving through that timber at close range, sound like men in heavy boots, deliberate and rhythmic. You hear them before you smell them, and you smell them before you see them. Everything in that forest makes its approach known, which is why the silence on that 5th night registered the way it did. By the time we made camp on November 11th, the temperature was 22 degrees and there was about 8 inches of snow on the ground at camp elevation, with more in the deeper timber. The sky was clear and the stars that first night were so dense you could almost hear them. We ate a hot meal over the camp stove, and Glenn told a story about a mule deer he had missed 15 years earlier in the Loxa country, and we laughed at him, as we always did at that story. And then we got into our sleeping bags in the wall tent with the small wood stove ticking as it cooled, and the temperature dropping and the forest settling into the particular silence that very cold wilderness achieves, which is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a quiet so thorough it has texture. Glenn said once that the Clearwater in November is not hunting country in the way that places with easy access and well-marked trails are hunting country. He said it is more like the mountain is interviewing you and you are finding out partway through the week whether you are equal to the position. He said it not as a complaint but as a point of pride, and I understood because I had felt it every year I went in. The wilderness does not grade on a curve. You are either capable of being there or you are not, and the mountain will tell you which before the week is out. We had good hunting the first several days. Roy arrowed a cow elk on the third morning at close range in a saddle about a mile and a half from camp, and we spent most of that day quartering and packing the meat back, hanging it from a pole between two trees well away from the tent. The work kept us warm, and it was necessary work, the kind of task that grounds you in the specifics of what you are doing in a place like that so that you are not out ahead of yourself imagining difficulties that have not arrived. That evening around the wood stove in the wall tent, all four of us were in a good mood, talking about the kind of nothing that men talk about in hunting camp when they are tired and fed and the pressure of the season has eased a little. Roy had his animal. The rest of us were still hunting, but the mood was easy. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned about Bigfoot doesn't fit into these videos, so I put it all in a book. It's called The Bigfoot Codex. If you ever want more, it's linked below.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Next 2 days were cold and clear, and we moved a lot of country without closing the distance on anything worth a shot. I jumped a large bull out of a thicket on the afternoon of the 5th day, caught a glimpse of heavy antler through the timber, but he was running hard downhill and was gone before I could get the rifle up. Glenn saw nothing but tracks. Leroy had a spiked bull inside 200 yards on the ridgetop south of camp, but held off because he was hoping for something bigger. The Clearwater country will do that to you. The elk in there run large, and when you have been hunting it for years, you develop standards that sometimes work against you. That 5th evening, I cooked a pot of elk chili from Roy's animal on the camp stove, and Glenn got out the deck of cards he had been carrying into elk camp for 15 years, and the four of us played pitch until 10 o'clock with the wood stove running and the wind coming up outside the tent walls. The temperature dropped below zero while we slept. I know because when I went out to check the horses, we always use pack horses on the longer trips, and our 3 horses were picketed in a stand of big spruce about 200 yards from the tent with grain bags and their own patience. The thermometer Glenn had nailed to the tree outside the tent read -4. The horses were fine. They stood close together, and their breath made a cloud that drifted in the still air, and they watched me check the picket lines with their eyes half closed, conserving everything. There is a silence that happens in those mountains in deep winter that is different from the silence of summer or even fall. In summer, the forest is full of small sounds, birds and insects, and the particular rustle of wind through leaves that are still attached to their branches. In fall, the leaves are down, but the elk are moving and rutting, and the coyotes are active, and the owls are calling at dusk and dawn. In winter, especially in the cold stretches, when the temperature drops below zero and everything that can go somewhere warmer has gone, the forest goes quiet in a way that has density to it, as if the cold itself is a substance filling the air between the trees and muffling the world. That kind of quiet is normal. I had slept inside it for decades. What I felt on the 5th night was different from that. Not the absence of sound from the cold, the absence of sound from a different cause. The kind of quiet that a forest produces when a presence enters it that does not belong to its normal inventory, when the animals and birds that make the ambient noise of the place have gone still in response to a presence that their senses have registered and their instincts have flagged. I have heard that quiet in context of bears before, that particular held breath quality when a large predator is moving through an area and the smaller animals have pressed themselves flat and silent. But a bear moves. A bear makes noise appropriate to its size. What was outside that tent was not moving. It was standing somewhere in the dark and the cold, and it was holding absolutely still, and the forest around it had gone silent, as a room goes silent when someone who should not be there walks in. I could not sleep well that fifth night. I lay in the sleeping bag listening to Glenn and Roy and Leroy breathing in the dark. I lay in the sleeping bag listening to Glenn and Roy and Leroy breathing in the dark and to the occasional pop and tick of the cooling stove. And I had the kind of restlessness that sometimes comes on in elk camp when you are close to an event and your body knows it before your mind does. I had felt it before, not always followed by anything, but sometimes it was accurate and I had learned not to discount it. The forest outside the tent was completely quiet in a way that the Clearwater forest is not always quiet. There were no owl calls, no movement sounds, no distant coyote, just the cold and the dark and the silence pressing in against the tent walls from all directions. I was up before light on November 16th. I built the fire in the wood stove, put the percolator on, and went outside to check the horses again by headlamp. They were in good shape, but they were alert, both ears forward, looking at the timber to the north with a focus that I registered and filed. Horses do not stare at nothing. I swept the headlamp through the tree line. Nothing visible, but the smell was there already, faint at that distance and in that cold air, present enough that I noticed it and could not place it, and I filed that too. I stood at the tree line with my headlamp off for a few minutes, letting my eyes adjust to the dark and listening. The horses had settled back to their normal posture by the time I reached them, but the direction they had been watching told me a fact. Horses do not rotate their attention without reason. Their necks were all pointed north when I first came out toward the upper drainage, toward the high ground, and that is not a direction from which anything usually moves in our camp. The elk come down from the high country at night to browse the lower elevations and move back up before first light. A bear working the creek drainage would come from below or from the side. Whatever the horses had been tracking with their attention had come from above them, from the direction of the high bench and the ridge beyond the tree line, and it had done so in the hours of true darkness before the dawn. I went back inside and did not immediately say anything to the others. I filed it. I have been doing this kind of work long enough, both mechanical and outdoors, to know the difference between information and alarm. And what I had was information. The horses had seen or smelled or heard a presence uphill of camp in the pre-dawn dark. The forest was quiet in an unusual way. These facts would either connect to other evidence during the day or they would not. The worst thing you can do in that kind of situation is spend your energy on possibilities instead of waiting for evidence. Over breakfast, I mentioned to the others that the horses seemed edgy and that the forest had been abnormally quiet overnight. Glenn said the cold sometimes did that, push wildlife into shelter and shut down the bird activity. Roy said he had noticed the quiet the evening before but had not thought much of it. Leroy ate his scrambled eggs and said nothing. This was typical of Leroy, who processed things internally and reported on them when he was done. On the morning of November 16th, our sixth day in camp, things changed. It had snowed overnight. Not a blizzard, but a steady, quiet snow that put down another 4 or 5 inches on top of what was already there. And in the first gray light, when I crawled out of the sleeping bag and unzipped the tent door, the world was white and still, and the air had that sharp, brittle quality that tells you the temperature has dropped significantly. I checked the thermometer. 8 degrees. The kind of cold that makes your diesel mechanic's fingers ache at the joints and your breath freeze on your beard before it has a chance to disperse. We cooked breakfast on the propane camp stove, scrambled eggs from a carton, canned corned beef hash, coffee from the percolator. The tent was warm from the wood stove, and the four of us sat close around it and talked through the plan for the day. Given the new snow and the cold, we decided to split into two pairs and work two different drainages that converged about 2.5 miles from camp. Glenn and I would take the north drainage, the one that ran up toward the high country ridge above timberline. Roy and Leroy would work the south draw, which had been holding elk sign in the wallows and brush pockets along the creek bottom. We would meet back at camp by mid-afternoon. Glenn and I left camp at 7:20 by my watch. The snow was still falling lightly, small, dry flakes that settled without sound, and our tracks filled in behind us as we moved up the drainage. The timber here was old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar at the lower elevations, transitioning to Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir as we gained elevation. At around 6,200 feet, the trees thinned and you could see the ridge above, a long exposed bench where the wind had scoured the snow into hard drifts and the few remaining trees were stunted and bent permanent from decades of winter. Elk used the timber for cover but moved onto that bench to feed on the sparse grass and the dwarf shrubs that poked through in the wind-scoured spots. We moved slowly, glassing ahead before each step in the open, pausing to listen every 100 yards or so. The new snow made things both better and worse. Better because any tracks would be fresh, laid down since midnight, easy to age and follow. Worse because the visibility in the falling snow was reduced to maybe 300 yards on the ridge and less in the timber, and the snow absorbed sound in a way that made the forest feel enclosed, intimate. The world shrunk down to what you could see from where you stood. I smelled it at about 8:30. I want to be precise about this because the smell is how the story really begins. We were in the timber, maybe 150 yards below the tree line, moving along a game trail that followed the contour of the ridge. The trail was well-used, old elk track packed down through layers of snow into a corridor that made travel easier, and Glenn was maybe 20 feet ahead of me when I stopped. The smell was organic and strong and unlike anything I had encountered in all my years in that forest. It was not elk. I know elk smell intimately, the musky, grassy, slightly sweet odor of a healthy animal that has been bedding in timber. Not bear either, that rancid, turned garbage smell of a bear that has been feeding through the fall. Not cat, not any predator I could name, and I have encountered most of what lives in those mountains at close enough range to catalog them by smell. This was something different. Heavy and warm like a large body generating tremendous heat in the cold air with an undertone that I can only describe as earthy and wild in a way that was not quite vegetable and not quite animal but contained elements of both. Dense, musky without being foul. The kind of smell that your body registers before your conscious mind has had a chance to evaluate it, that trips some older alarm that exists below rational processing. I have thought about that smell many times since, trying to find language for it that is precise enough to be useful. The closest I can come is this. Imagine taking everything that makes a large, warm-blooded animal what it is, the oils in its coat, the heat of its body radiating outward in cold air, the particular fermentation that happens in the digestive system of an animal that eats what this thing ate, which I would later conclude was meat and vegetation in roughly the proportions that an animal that size would need to maintain its mass, and concentrating all of that into a single olfactory event. Not like a zoo, which is animal waste in enclosed space. This was the smell of a wild animal in its own habitat, healthy and alive and close, but with a quality that I had never encountered in any wildlife context. There was a depth to it, a layering that reminded me of the smell of the deep timber itself, the composting duff and the resin, and the ancient organic accumulation of a forest floor that has not been disturbed in centuries. As if whatever produced the smell was not just in the forest, but of it, part of it in some way that went below the surface of the observation. Glenn would tell me later on the drive home that when he smelled it, his first thought was that an animal was dead nearby. Not because it smelled like death, but because the only other times he had smelled anything approaching that concentration of animal scent were when he had come across a carcass in the late stages of decomposition in warm weather. The smell of a large body releasing everything it contained. He said what came to him next was the realization that this smell was the opposite of that. It was not a body releasing what it contained. It was a body radiating what it contained. It was alive in a way that was almost aggressive in its aliveness, broadcasting its existence into the cold air with an intensity that seemed intentional. I held up my hand and Glenn stopped. He looked back at me. I pointed at my nose and he sniffed the air and his eyebrows went up and he nodded once. He smelled it too. We stood still and let the slight downslope breeze tell us where it was coming from. Above us, to the right where the timber thinned toward the bench, uphill. We did not speak. We moved off the trail into the deeper snow beside it where our footsteps would be quieter, and we worked our way uphill through the trees with the rifles off our shoulders and the safeties on but accessible. My eyes were going from the snow ahead of me to the timber in every direction. Glenn was doing the same. Whatever was uphill from us, close enough to saturate the air with its scent in a light wind. We had not seen it and it had not seen us. And in that kind of situation, you move slowly and you keep your options open. We found the first print about 40 yards farther up the trail. It was in the game trail itself, pressed deep into the packed snow, and I knew the moment I saw it that it was not from anything in the standard inventory of North Idaho wildlife. The shape was human, bipedal, with a heel, an arch, a ball, and toes. But the scale was wrong in a way that stopped my breath mid-inhale. The print measured when I laid my rifle alongside it for reference and calculated later against the barrel length I knew by heart. Approximately 17 to 18 inches from heel to toe. The width across the ball of the foot was close to 8 inches. The stride to the next print, which we found after a moment's searching, was between 5 and 6 feet. The depth of the impression in the packed snow relative to where my own boots were sinking told you this track was made by something that carried considerably more weight than any person. Whatever had made this track was walking, not running uphill through deep snow, and it was walking on 2 legs. I knelt down beside the print and looked at it without touching it. The dermal ridges were visible in the packed snow at the heel and at the ball, the pattern of them consistent and fine, the way skin detail only transfers into a medium when the contact pressure is significant enough to press every surface of the foot firmly against the receiving material. This was not a partial print, not the compressed outline of an animal that had trotted through. This was a full-weight, flat-footed impression. Every square inch of the sole had contacted the snow, and every detail of the sole was recorded in it. I have taken enough tracking courses and followed enough animals in snow to know what I was looking at in terms of technique, and what I was looking at was a textbook bipedal walking track made by a being that was very large and very heavy and was not in any hurry. I placed my own boot beside it, not in it, to preserve the track. My boot is a size 11. A size 11 boot is approximately 12 inches from heel to toe. The print beside my boot extended approximately 5.5 to 6 inches beyond the toe of my boot. I did not need to do the arithmetic in my head because it was already done the moment I saw the comparison. Nothing that walks on 2 legs in North Idaho in November makes a print that size. Nothing that walks on 2 legs anywhere on this planet except in the accounts of people who had always been told they were imagining things makes a print that size. Glenn crouched beside the print and studied it without touching it. He looked up at me. Neither of us said the word that was forming in both our minds. The print was fresh, no more than a few hours old, based on the slight rounding of the edges where the ongoing snowfall had just begun to soften the sharp definition of the heel and toes. Whoever had made tracks like these was not far ahead of us. We followed them upward. The trail went another 60 yards through the timber and then broke out onto the bench above tree line. And on the bench in the open, with the gray morning sky overhead and the snow falling in fine dry curtains around us, we found what had made the tracks. It was down, not dead, down, leaning against a boulder that protruded from the bench on the uphill side, with its back against the rock and its legs extended in the snow and its upper body hunched over something it held, pressed against its chest. I saw it at the same moment Glenn did, maybe 120 yards out, and I put my hand on Glenn's arm, and we stopped. It was large, sitting against the boulder with its legs forward. I could not get a clean read on height, but the mass of it was unmistakable. The upper body was enormous, wide through the shoulders in a way that suggested a chest depth and breadth that had nothing to do with clothing or bulk. It was covered in dark hair, a deep brown that was nearly black in the flat light of the overcast morning, dense and close-lying like an animal's winter coat at its thickest, and it covered everything except the face and the palms of the hands. The face I could not see clearly at that distance and in that light. The hands were visible because they were cupped around the thing it held against its chest, and even at 120 yards I could see that the hands were proportioned like human hands, but scaled to dimensions that made no sense on any frame I had ever seen. It was not moving. Its head was down, tilted toward what it held. I want to slow down here and tell you precisely what the next 30 seconds were like, because they were the 30 seconds that changed everything that came after. And I have replayed them so many times over 34 years that I can move through them frame by frame in my memory as clearly as if they are happening right now. I was at the tree line just inside the cover of the last stunted spruce before the bench opened up, and I was looking across approximately 120 yards of open snow at a figure that was sitting against a boulder approximately 8 feet high and twice that in width. The snow between me and the figure was unbroken except for the tracks that led to it, which I could see now as a continuous line from the timber's edge to the boulder, a line of deep impressions in the fresh snow that told the whole story of a very large thing that had been walking and was now sitting. The snow around the boulder was packed and compressed in a radius of several feet, the kind of compression you get when significant weight has been stationary for an extended period in conditions where the cold keeps the snow dry and the body heat of whatever is sitting in it gradually sinks downward through the pack. The figure was covered from the crown of its head to the tops of its feet in hair that was dense and dark and lay against its body as a working dog's coat lies close and insulating, not shaggy or unkempt, but tight and thick and clearly adequate to what the weather was doing. I could see individual hairs moving in the light wind that came across the bench from the ridge above. The arms were large, longer relative to the torso than a human's arms would be, with the forearms resting on its knees and the hands cupped inward toward its chest around the thing it was holding. The shoulders above those arms were wide in a way that I kept trying to normalize and could not. I have worked on heavy equipment for 40 years. I know what machinery looks like, the shapes that result from engineering a structure to bear tremendous loads. The shoulders of that figure had that quality. They were not large from bulk or fat. They were large from structure, from the underlying architecture of bone and tendon that you put in a body when you design it to do serious work in serious conditions. The chest. I spent a long time looking at the chest in my scope because the chest was where the thing was holding what it held, and I needed to understand what the object was, and in order to understand it, I needed to understand the chest that contained it. The chest was, to use the only word I can find, immense, not the immensity of obesity or bloating, the immensity of capacity, the deep barrel of a body built to breathe at altitude and sustain effort over long distances in cold that would shut a human body down. The chest was rising and falling with the figure's breathing, and the breathing was slow and deliberate and not labored, which told me a fact about whatever reserves it was running on despite the injury. Its body was managing, it was hurt, and it had lost significant blood, and it had been sitting in 8-degree air for an unknown number of hours, and it was still breathing with a regularity that spoke to a physiology considerably more robust than anything I had encountered in the woods before. It was not moving. Its head was down, tilted toward what it held. The posture was the posture of an injured body, exhausted and held in place by its own limits, a heaviness about the way it sat against the boulder that told me it had not chosen that position for comfort or concealment. It was there because it could not go farther. I touched Glenn's sleeve and we backed into the tree line, moving backwards step by step until the timber was between us and the bench. Then I got on the radio and called Roy and Leroy. We had a pair of handheld radios, the kind that truckers used before cell phones took over everything. I told Roy where we were and told him to come up the north drainage to our position and to do it quietly. Roy asked if we had elk. I said no. He asked what we had. I said I would explain when they got there. He said they were moving. Glenn and I waited in the timber for 22 minutes. The smell was still present in the air, constant, filling the cold atmosphere around the bench. While we waited, I glassed the shape through my rifle scope. At the magnification I had set, I could see more detail than I wanted to be able to see, and less than I needed. The hair was real hair, not the way a coat or costume would lie. It moved when the wind came through, individual strands catching the light the way hair catches light, and the texture of it was coarse and long, especially on the forearms and down the shins, thinner on the torso and densest across the upper back and shoulders where it had the look of hair that had been grown for insulation against serious cold. The face was partially obscured by the downward tilt of the head, but I could see a broad, flat nose, a heavy brow ridge that shaded the eyes, and a jaw that was wide and set forward in a way that was familiar and not familiar at the same time. During those 22 minutes, the figure did not move significantly. It shifted its weight once, adjusting the position of the juvenile against its chest, and the movement was careful and deliberate, managed, the motion of a body working around pain it did not want to trigger. The juvenile moved in response, and the large figure lowered its head again, and the chest sounds continued. That deep, low vibration that I could not quite hear through the scope, but that I could see in the resonance it produced, the faint visible tremor of the chest and throat that a sustained low vocalization makes when the rest of the body is still. I studied the wound in those 22 minutes as carefully as I could. The blood had clotted heavily in the hair on the left side, which was the best possible outcome of a bad situation. Blood clots in cold air faster than it does in warmth, and whatever had happened long enough ago that the acute bleeding had stopped and the clot had had time to set. But the extent of the blood staining in the hair told me the original bleed had been serious. The stain began at the upper left chest, slightly below the shoulder, and extended in a wide swath down the left flank and onto the left forearm where the arm had pressed against the wound at some point. The dark matting of the hair in that region was extensive, a handspan wide at minimum across the chest entry point, and the fact that the figure was still upright and conscious and functional after losing what that staining represented told me a great deal about its physiology that I filed for later. In the scope at high magnification, I could also see the face clearly enough to study it. The brow ridge was pronounced, jutting forward above the eyes in a way that I associated with heaviness of bone rather than with any specific expression. The nose was broad and flat with wide nostrils that flared slightly in a rhythm that was not quite the same as the breathing rhythm of the chest, which told me it was processing smell separately from breathing, which is a capability that most animals have but that humans have largely lost. It was smelling the air constantly, cataloging it, and I understood that we were in its catalog, that it had known we were in the timber before we had known it was on the bench, that the 22 minutes we waited in the tree line were 22 minutes during which it was deciding what to do about the two humans it had already detected, one of whom was carrying a firearm it could identify by smell or by sight or by some combination that I had no framework to evaluate. The expression, what I could read of it from 120 yards through a rifle scope in fading snowfall, was one I recognized, not from any animal, from people, from men I had seen at the shop when a bad situation, when a man is hurt and he knows it and he is trying to hold on because there is no other option. The face was set hard with pain, and then there was the thing it was holding. I worked the scope down toward its chest, trying to bring the object into focus. It was small, whatever it was, too small to be a cub of anything, small enough to cup in both hands, though those hands were enormous. And it was alive. I could see it moving, a slight intermittent motion, a shifting that was not caused by the wind or by any movement from the large figure holding it. Whatever it was holding was alive, and it was moving, and it was warm because the large figure had both arms wrapped around it and was holding it flat against his chest in a way that was not about restraint. It was about warmth, about keeping the small living thing in contact with the most reliable heat source available to it. Roy and Leroy came up through the timber behind us at 8:47. I can be precise because I checked my watch when I heard them coming and was relieved when it was them. We pulled back another 20 yards from the tree line, and I explained in a low voice what we had found. I told them about the tracks, the size of the figure, the hair, the posture. I told them it was injured or appeared to be. I told them it was holding something alive. Roy and Leroy listened without expression. Roy asked to see it. We moved back to the tree line, and I let each of them glass it in turn. Roy glassed it for a full 2 minutes without speaking. He was a man who moved slowly through the world, who took time with things, and he used every second of those 2 minutes in a way that told me he was not going to say anything until he had formed a complete opinion. When he handed the binoculars to Leroy and stepped back from the tree line, the look on his face was one I recognized from the times I had seen him deal with a situation that was bigger than the tools he had brought to address it. Roy Stites was a practical man. He had spent 30 years managing the machinery and the men in a lumber mill, and the particular expression he wore when a situation exceeded his operational parameters was one of very careful, very quiet recalibration. He wore that expression now. Leroy glassed it for less time than Roy had. Leroy processed things faster, made decisions faster, got to conclusions faster than most people I had known, which was partly temperament and partly the fact that driving a log truck on mountain roads teaches you to evaluate situations quickly because the alternative is going off the road on a switchback. He lowered the binoculars, and I could see in the set of his jaw that he had arrived somewhere. Leroy handed the binoculars back to me and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I have heard people talk about this. I never believed it." Roy said something in a low voice that I won't repeat here because it was a prayer and it was private. Glenn had his eyes on the bench and his hand on the stock of his rifle, not aggressive, not ready to shoot, but the hand of a man who does not know what to do and is defaulting to what he knows. The wind shifted then. It came down off the ridge behind the boulder, swung around, and went across the bench toward the timber where we stood, and I knew in the instant before it happened that it was going to smell us. Its head came up. The face turned in our direction, and I saw it clearly for the first time, maybe 100 yards now because we had crept closer while Roy and Leroy glassed. The brow was heavy and pronounced, the eyes deep-set and dark, the nose broad and flat across the bridge. The mouth was set in a hard line. It was not a face I would call human, not exactly, but I would also be lying to you if I said it was the face of an animal. There was a quality in the eyes when they locked onto the tree line where we stood. Not aggression, not the flat, immediate threat response of a predator assessing prey. More complex than that. The kind of thing that in a person you would call fear mixed with calculation. It was looking at us and thinking, whatever it was doing at that moment, it was thinking about us. Glenn raised the rifle. Not to aim, not with intent, just the instinctive lifting of the weapon that men do when a large, unknown presence fixes its eyes directly on them. And the figure, in response to that motion, pulled the thing it held tighter against its chest and made a sound. The sound came down the bench and through the cold air and hit me in the sternum before it reached my ears. Low, guttural but not aggressive. Not a roar, not a threat sound. It was short and sharp, and it contained something that I processed not in my thinking mind, but somewhere below that. Somewhere older, an urgency, a desperation. It sounded like a warning, but not the kind of warning that means stay away. The kind of warning that means please, do not, please. And that was when I stepped in front of Glenn's rifle with my palm out and said it. Nobody shoot. It's holding something. What happened in the next 3 seconds is what I will carry for the rest of my life. The figure on the bench, holding whatever it held against its chest, looked at me. Not at Glenn with the rifle. At me. At the man who had stepped in front of the barrel. And it held my eyes for a moment that stretched out beyond its actual duration. 3 seconds, maybe 4, that contained the entire weight of what we were doing there on that bench in that snow with the cold pressing in from all directions. Then it looked down at what it held, and it looked back at me, and it made the sound again, softer this time, a sound like a question. Glenn lowered the rifle. He lowered it slowly and deliberately, and he did not raise it again. None of us spoke for what felt like a long time. The snow fell through the silence. The wind moved across the bench and turned the dry flakes horizontal, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Roy was to my left, and Leroy was behind me, and Glenn was at my shoulder, and all 4 of us were looking at the same thing, which was a figure sitting against a boulder on a high bench above the timberline in the Clearwater National Forest in northern Idaho, covered in dark hair, holding something small and alive against a chest the size of a barrel, looking at us. I took a step out of the tree line. Glenn said my name once, quietly. I kept moving. I did not know why exactly, and I want to be honest about that. There was no plan, no calculation that I ran and came out right. Something in the sound it had made, something in how it looked from what it held to. The man who had stepped in front of the rifle told me that I needed to close the distance between us, that the distance was itself part of the problem. I have been asked in the years since why I walked out there. It is a reasonable question. I had a rifle. I had 3 other men with rifles. Whatever was on that bench, whatever it was large and capable, and had already demonstrated that it was aware of us and had been tracking us since before we cleared the tree line. A rational evaluation of the risk-reward profile of walking toward it unarmed would have produced a strong recommendation to stay in the cover of the timber. I understand this. I cannot fully explain the decision I made, but I will try. Part of it was the sound. The sound it had made when Glenn raised the rifle was not the sound of a thing preparing to fight. It was the sound of a thing that understood what the rifle meant and was afraid of it and was asking, in the only language available to it, for something other than what the rifle represented. I had heard variations of that sound before. I had heard it from animals in distress, and I had heard it from people in distress, and the specific quality that distinguishes a sound of genuine desperation from a sound of threat is a distinction that you learn to recognize if you spend enough of your life in situations where the distinction matters. I had spent enough of mine. The other part was simpler. There was a small one pressed against that chest that needed warmth, and the large figure could not provide it adequately because it was wounded and losing heat itself. And whatever other calculation I might have run about the wisdom of approaching a being of that size and that unknown nature, the small one going cold registered in me at a level that overrode the calculation. I walked forward across the bench with my rifle slung over my shoulder and my hands where they could be seen. The snow was deep here between my boots and my knees in places, and the going was slow and deliberate. I watched the figure's face the entire time I was walking. The eyes tracked me. The posture did not change. It did not rise, did not move toward me or away from me. It watched me come with the same expression I had seen in the scope, which was pain and calculation and a quality that I can only call endurance. It was enduring. It was doing what you do when the situation offers no good options and you have to manage with what is available to you, which is to stay still and assess and hold on. At about 40 yards, I stopped, close enough now that I could see detail without the scope. The dark hair was dense and heavy, matted in one place on the upper left shoulder in a way that I looked at for a moment before I understood what I was looking at. The matting was darker than the surrounding hair, and it extended in a long stain down the left side of the rib cage. It was not mud. The color was wrong for mud, and the way it had clotted the hair was wrong. It was dried blood, a significant amount of dried blood. Whatever injury had put this figure against this boulder had involved blood loss that I did not want to estimate. I said out loud into the cold morning, "I don't know what you understand, but I'm not going to hurt you." No response. The eyes did not blink. The figure held my gaze with a steadiness that was not hostile and was not submissive. It was reading me as a mechanic reads an engine, methodically and without emotion, looking for information. I crouched slowly in the snow, reducing my profile, making myself smaller. I took off my rifle and laid it in the snow beside me. I held both hands up, palms out, showing that they were empty. Something changed in the eyes, not dramatic. A fractional shift in the set of the brow, a slight release of the tension in the jaw. Whatever it had been calculating about me, something had shifted in the calculation. Then it lowered its hands slowly, and I saw what it had been holding. It was a juvenile. Small, maybe 20 inches from crown to feet, built on the same lines as the large figure, but miniature, with the same dense hair but much finer, softer, and less coarse than a grown dog's coat. The juvenile was conscious, its eyes open and blinking against the falling snow, but its movements were sluggish and weak. The kind of motion that tells you a body is working hard just to maintain basic function and not managing much beyond that. It was alive. It was cold. The large figure had kept it pressed against its chest for warmth, but the large figure was losing heat from the injury on its left side, and whatever the small one needed, it was not getting enough of it. Not here. Not in 8-degree air with the wind coming off the high ridge. I understood at that moment what the situation was. Not completely, not in any clinical detail, but in the way a father understands because I am a father. And there is a particular kind of look that goes between a parent and anyone who stands between that parent and whatever help their child needs. I had seen it in hospital waiting rooms in Orofino. I had seen it on the faces of parents who brought their kids into the emergency room at 3 in the morning when something had gone wrong. I was seeing it now in a face that was not human in the ways that matter to taxonomy, on a bench in the snow in north central Idaho. I turned back toward the tree line and called to Glenn. I said, "Bring the first aid kit, bring the emergency blankets." Glenn stared at me across the bench for a moment that contained several years of friendship and the unspoken question of whether I had lost my mind. Then he turned to Leroy, who went back into the timber where the packs were. Glenn walked out onto the bench toward me, moving steadily, not looking directly at the figure in my peripheral vision, but not looking away from me either. Roy stayed at the tree line with his hand on his rifle, not threatening, just present. I turned back to the figure. It had watched the exchange between Glenn and me, its eyes moving from one to the other of us, reading the situation between us. I said again, "We are not going to hurt you. We want to help." I do not know if those words carried specific meaning to it, but tone carries farther than vocabulary, and I said them with the tone I would use on a frightened animal or a frightened child, level and quiet and without any edge, and I watched its grip on the juvenile shift slightly, still protective but not as rigid as it had been. Glenn reached me and crouched in the snow beside me. He looked at the figure for a long moment without expression. He had known me for 16 years. He had read terrain and animals and weather with me for 16 years, and he was doing the same now. Then he looked at the blood matted into the hair on its left side. He said, quietly, to me only, "It's been shot." I had not gotten there yet to the specific cause, but Glenn said it, and it landed. I looked again at the wound site, and he was right. The blood distribution, the way the hair was matted outward from a central point rather than just stained from a cut or a scrape, the location and the angle. Something had entered from the front left side and apparently either passed through or was still in there, and the wound had been bleeding, probably seriously, and was now clotted and cooling in the 8-degree air. The clotting was the only reason it was still functional at all. We had no way to know when it had happened. We did not know how far it had traveled to reach this bench. What we knew was that it was sitting in deep snow at elevation, injured, with a small one that needed warmth it could not fully provide in conditions that would kill it if it stayed there much longer. Glenn opened the first aid kit. We kept a substantial kit for backcountry trips. Nothing surgical, but enough for serious wound care in the field. Gauze pads, medical tape, a hemostatic agent quick clot, the kind that hunting outfitters were beginning to stock in the late 80s, surgical scissors, a foil emergency blanket in a small orange pouch, 2 more emergency blankets from the gear bags Leroy had brought out of the timber. I spoke in a low, steady voice the entire time Glenn was unpacking the kit. Not to say anything particular, just the sound of a voice held at a consistent low pitch, pitched low and steady as you would use near a horse you were working around. I told it we were going to put something warm on the small one. I told it the blanket would hold heat. I told it we were going to look at the wound on the side and that it would hurt, and I was sorry for that, but we needed to see what we were working with. I do not know how much it understood. What I know is that it did not move when Glenn shook out the first emergency blanket and crept forward on his knees through the snow and draped it carefully across the juvenile and the large figure's chest and arms. The foil crinkled in the cold air and the figure's eyes went to the blanket, processing what this was and what it was for. Glenn wrapped the foil around the juvenile as well as he could without taking it from the figure's grip, tucking it close, pressing the edges in. When the blanket was in place, the large figure held it there with both hands, pressing it close against the small one, and I watched the tension in its jaw ease. The second blanket we wrapped around the large figure's shoulders and back, working carefully around to the injured side. When Glenn's hands came close to the wound, the figure made a sound. Short, involuntary, the sound a person makes when pressure contacts a place that has been hurting for a long time. Glenn stopped immediately. I said, "Steady." I said it to Glenn, and I said it to the figure, and both of them held still. Glenn packed both sides of the wound with gauze and secured it with tape, working with a patience and a care that I will never forget. Glenn Hobson was a machinist by trade and a hunting guide by passion, and he had never finished high school, and he handled that wound with more gentleness than most people bring to most things. The figure held still through all of it, making no further sounds after that first involuntary one, though I could see in the set of its face that the handling was causing real pain, that it was managing by force of will alone. It was managing it because it had decided to let us work, and it held to that decision through the parts that hurt. The quick clot went in first, packed directly against the wound surface on both the entry and exit sides. Quick clot in the late 80s was a granular zeolite compound that worked by accelerating the clotting cascade when it contacted blood. And it was already becoming standard in hunting first aid kits because it worked in exactly the kind of field conditions we were in. Glenn applied it carefully, tamping it into the wound with gauze, working with the patience of a man who understood that he had one chance to do this right and that the alternative to doing it right was watching the figure bleed out on a bench in North Idaho while its juvenile went cold against his chest. The figure held completely still during the application of the quick clot. When the granules contacted the raw wound tissue, I saw the muscles of the left flank contract in a spasm that lasted 2 or 3 seconds and then resolved. The jaw tightened and the nostrils flared, and then the breathing resumed its previous rhythm. That was all. It made no sound. It did not pull away. It sat against the boulder and endured the procedure with a discipline that I found staggering. I have seen grown men scream and thrash during the cleaning and treatment of wounds far less serious than what that figure was sustaining. I have seen men in the shop lose composure entirely over deep cuts and crush injuries that would have been managed by this figure as a background problem. Glenn packed the entry wound with gauze pads layered 3 deep and taped them with the surgical tape from the kit, running the tape around the left side of the chest in both directions to anchor the dressing against movement. The exit wound on the back was harder to access because the figure's back was against the boulder, but Glenn worked around its left side with a patience I have never seen him apply to anything before or since. At one point, his arm was essentially underneath the figure's left arm, and he was working blind by feel, and the figure allowed this, holding its left arm slightly elevated from its normal position to give him the access he needed. I cannot tell you whether the figure understood what Glenn was doing in any technical medical sense. I do not know what its understanding of the causal relationship between gauze and bleeding would have been. What I can tell you is that it cooperated, deliberately and intelligently cooperated with a procedure that was painful and that required it to remain still while a human being it had only known for about 20 minutes worked at close range on a wound in its side. That is not animal behavior. That is not the behavior of a thing operating purely on instinct. That is the behavior of a mind that assessed the situation, concluded that cooperation was the better option, and made a decision. When Glenn had the wound dressed as well as we could manage, he sat back on his heels in the snow and looked at me. He said, "It needs to stay warm and it needs to stay still." We covered it with the third emergency blanket, tucking it in as thoroughly as we could around its body and the juvenile. Roy had come out from the tree line by this point, and the four of us were crouched in a loose semicircle in the snow, close enough to the figure that the warmth radiating from its body was noticeable in the cold air. That surprised me. Despite the blood loss and the cold and the hours of exposure, it was still generating substantial heat. More than a human body could in those conditions, significantly more, as if its baseline metabolism ran at a higher temperature than ours, even under duress. The snow within 3 feet of where it sat had melted slightly and refrozen into a ring of compressed white around the boulder, and that told you something warm had been sitting against that rock for a while before we arrived. Roy had brought food from the packs. He had brought what we had that was ready to eat without preparation, a bag of jerky and some crackers and a foil packet of peanut butter that he had stuffed in his coat pocket. He looked at me, and I looked at the figure, and I said slowly, "I am going to put food here. The food is for you and the small one." He placed the jerky and the crackers in the snow between his position and the figure's legs and backed away a few steps. The figure looked at the food for a long time, long enough that I thought it would not acknowledge it. Then one of those large hands came out from under the emergency blanket and picked up a piece of jerky with a precision that startled me. Not a grab. A deliberate pickup, thumb and 2 fingers, controlled and exact. It brought the jerky to its face and smelled it first, a long assessment with the eyes partially closed. Then it bit off a piece and chewed and looked at us. Whatever it concluded, it took another piece. We sat on that bench above the tree line of the Clearwater National Forest for 4.5 hours. I know because I checked my watch when we first came out of the timber, and I checked it again when we finally made the decision to move, and the space between those two readings was 4 hours and 23 minutes. During those 4 hours, several things happened that I will describe as carefully as I can, because the details are what I have been carrying for 34 years and what I need to set down now. The juvenile grew more active as it warmed. At first it was only the slight, weak movements I had seen from 120 yards, the kind of motion a body makes when it is working on bare maintenance. Then, as the emergency blanket held the heat in and the large figure continued to generate warmth beneath it, the small one began to move more purposefully, turned its head, gripped the large figure's forearm with both hands in a clench I could see was tight even from where I sat, produced sounds small and intermittent that I could feel at the edge of my hearing more than I could strictly hear them, low-frequency vibrations that registered in my back teeth and sternum. The large figure responded to each sound the juvenile made, a touch, a repositioning of the blanket, a low vocalization from somewhere in its chest rather than its throat, sustained and even more felt than heard. It was not responding reflexively as an animal responds to distress calls. It was responding with intention, adjusting to the specific content of each small sound the juvenile made, answering with a response that was clearly calibrated to what it had heard. I have a mechanic's ear from 4 decades under engines, and I am telling you there was structure in those sounds. Call and response, variations in pitch and duration that were not random. A language operating below the range my ear was built for, and I could recognize it as language the same way you can tell that people speaking in a language you have never heard are still speaking rather than making noise. The juvenile's recovery over those 4 hours was one of the most specific things I witnessed on that bench, and I want to describe it accurately because it tells you a great deal about the physiology of these animals that no other part of the story does quite so directly. In the first hour, the small one's movements were primarily reflexive, the gripping of the large figure's arm that I mentioned, the turning of the head, small adjustments of position that were not goal-directed but reactive, the body moving in response to temperature changes or to the sound of the large figure's chest vocalizations. The eyes were open, but the tracking was intermittent. It would fix on one of us, the orange foil of the emergency blanket, a movement in the snow, and then the focus would drift, and the eyes would partially close and then reopen. It was holding on, but not fully present. In the second hour, the tracking improved. By mid-hour, it was looking at each of us in sequence, moving its gaze from one face to the next with a deliberateness that told you the processing was returning. At one point, it looked at me for a sustained period, perhaps 30 seconds, with an attention that felt specific and evaluative. I did not look away. I held its gaze as you hold the gaze of an animal or a person you want to communicate intent to without words, which is steadily and without challenge the look that says, I am here and I am not going anywhere and I am not a threat. The small one held my gaze for those 30 seconds and then turned back to the large figure and made a sound, and the large figure produced a response that was immediate and specific, a particular sequence of chest tones that differed from the general comfort vocalizations it had been making, as if the small one had relayed information and the large figure had replied. In the third hour, the juvenile was fully alert. It sat upright against the large figure's chest, rather than lying flat against it, which is a significant developmental marker in terms of recovery from hypothermic exposure, because it means the core temperature had returned to a level where the body could spend energy on posture and attention rather than pure maintenance. It examined the emergency blanket at length, touching the foil material with the back of one hand and then with the palm, as if cataloging the texture. At one point, it reached out toward the pile of food wrappers that had accumulated in the snow between our position and the boulder, and the large figure's hand came up immediately and gently redirected the small arm back to within the blanket. Not a correction, more of a guidance, the instinctive redirection of a parent steering a child clear of hazard. It was in the third hour that the juvenile made its first sound directed at anyone other than the large figure. It was a short vocalization, 2 tones in rapid sequence, and it was directed at Glenn, who was sitting the closest of the 4 of us to the boulder. Glenn looked up from the snow he had been staring at and held still. The juvenile made the sound again. Glenn, who is not a man given to impulse, reached slowly into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of beef jerky he had been saving for the afternoon, and he held it out at arm's length in the space between himself and the boulder. The juvenile looked at the jerky, it looked at Glenn, it looked at the large figure, and the large figure looked at the jerky and then at Glenn and then made a sound. The juvenile reached out and took the jerky from Glenn's hand, and Glenn sat back and folded his hands and said nothing, and I watched his face change that afternoon that I do not have adequate words for. Roy brought the camp thermos of coffee out from the pack and poured cups for all 4 of us. Nobody spoke much. We sat in the cold with our cups and we watched, and the snow fell around us, and the hours went by, and the large figure on the boulder watched us back. What I noticed over those 4 hours was the change in how it watched us. At the beginning, when I had walked out across the bench and crouched in the snow, its eyes had been the eyes of an injured being with no good options, measuring each of us for threat, calculating every movement for what it might mean. By the second hour, a shift had happened in that assessment. Not trust, not fully, nothing as settled as trust, but a recalibration. We had not moved toward it aggressively. We had not tried to approach the juvenile uninvited. We had provided warmth and food, and had then sat down and been still. And in response to all of that, the quality of its attention changed from the hard, narrow focus of threat assessment to something broader, an awareness that included us in the scene rather than placing us at its edge as danger. I thought about where we were, not just geographically, though the geography mattered. This bench was not an accidental resting spot. The high bench above tree line with the boulder to protect its back, the clear sight lines in every direction, the ability to see anything coming from below before it could close the distance. An injured being carrying something small and vulnerable that needed warmth had climbed to the highest defensible ground it could reach. It had made a tactical decision. It had identified the best available position in a deteriorating situation, and it had gotten there even hurt, even bleeding, because the small one needed whatever advantage that position could provide. I thought about what that meant. I thought about a night 9 years earlier when Kevin, my older boy, was 4 years old and had a febrile seizure at 2 in the morning, and I had driven to Orofino General with him in my arms because I would not wait for the ambulance, and Joanne was in the back seat talking to him, and I drove faster than I should have on those roads, and I remember the calculation I was running the entire time, which was not a rational calculation at all, which was simply this: what do I need to do right now to keep this child alive? That calculation does not have a species. It does not have a taxonomy. It runs in any parent in any situation where the child is in danger. And it was running in that figure on that boulder as clearly as it had ever run in me. Glenn said something during the third hour that I have thought about often since. He was looking at the boulder, at the way the large figure had positioned itself against it, and he said quietly, just to me, that thing chose this rock. I said, what do you mean? He said, look at the approach tracks. They do not go straight up the ridge to the bench. They angle across the face. It was not just climbing, it was crossing to reach this specific position. With that wound, with that small one, it was not just getting to high ground. It was getting to this high ground, this rock in particular. I looked at the tracks again from our position and understood what Glenn had seen. The line of impressions coming from the timber below did not take the most direct uphill route. They followed a slight traverse that would have added time and distance to the climb, and they ended at the largest boulder on that bench, the one with the deep concavity on the downhill face that created exactly the kind of sheltered overhang that would break the wind from above and protect anything sitting against its south face. It had not stumbled to the nearest high point. It had navigated to a specific sheltered position with specific tactical advantages, and it had done this while losing blood and carrying the small one. I thought about that for a long time during the third hour, while the snow fell and the coffee went cold in my cup and the figures on the boulder moved through their slow recovery. A mind that could make that calculation under those conditions was not operating on reflex. A mind that could assess the terrain, identify the optimal defensive position, and navigate to it while managing a wound and a dependent was doing a kind of reasoning that we do not usually credit to anything that we are not comfortable calling a person. Leroy fell asleep against his pack at some point in the third hour. He was not being cavalier. He was 58 years old, and he had carried a heavy pack 7 miles in and put down hard miles every day since, and his body simply made the decision for him. He woke up 20 minutes later and looked at the figure on the boulder and then looked at me, and I shook my head slightly to say, nothing has changed, and he nodded and drank the rest of his cold coffee. In the fourth hour, the figure tried to stand. It was a process, not a smooth rise. The first attempt ended quickly when the left side of its torso contracted and it stopped and made a sound I had not heard from it before, a short, low sound that was not pure pain, but contained pain in it as a held breath contains effort. It sat back against the boulder. Glenn and I looked at each other. I said, "Lo, it's trying to move. We need to let it move when it's ready." Glenn nodded. The second attempt, 10 minutes later, was more successful. It got to its knees, keeping the juvenile pressed against its chest with the right arm and using the left hand on the boulder for purchase. I could see the effort in the left arm, the way it was compensating for the wound in the chest wall, taking weight carefully and transferring it with deliberate control. It was 3/4 upright when it paused and looked at us. All four of us were still and silent. Then it straightened fully. It stood for a moment with the juvenile against its chest and ran through what I can only describe as an inventory of its own condition. The sequence was methodical. It tested the left foot first, shifting weight onto it and then off, then the right. It brought the left arm up slightly from its body and rotated the shoulder once, slowly, and the muscles in the left side of the torso moved with it in a way that confirmed the wound was deep enough to involve the chest wall musculature. It drew a slow breath through the nose, held it for 2 full seconds, released it, testing lung capacity, testing what the wound would allow on a full breath. It looked at the juvenile, not a quick glance, but a full examination, tilting its head to see the small face directly. The juvenile met its gaze and made a sound, and the large figure responded, and the exchange was brief and specific. And I believed then and believe now that it contained information, a status report, a confirmation. Then it looked at the horizon, the ridge above the bench, the high country, the direction it needed to go. It read the sky with the attention experienced hunters give it, taking in the cloud cover and the wind direction and the quality of the light and drawing conclusions from all of it simultaneously. The snowfall had intensified in the early afternoon. The visibility on the bench was down to 200 yards. The temperature was not improving. Everything it read in the sky told it the same thing the wound and the juvenile's need for warmth told it, which was that staying on the bench through another night was not a viable option. Standing on the bench in the snow, it was tall. Standing with nothing around it to set a false scale, it was substantially taller than anything I had a reference for in that context. I am 6 feet even, and Glenn is 6'2", and this figure above us on the bench looked down on both of us from a height that I estimated later with the boulder as a reference point I could measure at close to 8.5 feet. Standing upright in the open air with the gray Idaho sky behind it and snow falling around it and the emergency blanket hanging from its shoulders where we had wrapped it, it was the largest living thing I had ever stood near that was not a machine. The size of it was different in a way that I cannot fully explain. Not just big, proportioned for the world it lived in, every part of it at scale with every other part, a body that had been made for something more demanding than what most bodies are made for. It stood for a moment and seemed to be testing the left side, testing the limits of what the wound would allow. It turned partially away from us, looking upslope toward the high ridge where the snow was coming harder now in the early afternoon light. Then it turned back. What happened next is the thing I have tried to find language for on 1,000 different nights. And I am going to tell you plainly that I have not found language equal to it. The figure looked at us, not at Glenn, not at Roy or Leroy, at me, directly at me with those deep-set dark eyes for maybe 5 seconds. And then it made a sound, not the vocalization it had been using with the juvenile, not the warning sound it had made when Glenn raised the rifle. A different sound, shorter, lower, directed at me specifically. I cannot tell you what it meant. I am a diesel mechanic from Orofino, and I do not have the tools to decode something like that. What I can tell you is what it felt like when directed at me, and what it felt like was an acknowledgement. Like someone saying, I see you. Like someone saying, I know what you did and what it cost you. Like the sound a person makes when words are not sufficient and a sound will have to serve instead, and they make the best sound they can, and it carries the weight they intended it to carry. Then it turned and walked up the bench toward the high ridge carrying the juvenile, the emergency blanket still around its shoulders, moving with a gait that favored the right side but covered ground at a pace that I could not have matched in deep snow on healthy legs. We watched until the snow in the distance swallowed it. It did not look back. We watched it for as long as we could see it, which was not long. The snowfall and the distance worked together as that country does, turning a definite form into an outline and then into a shape and then into a suggestion and then into nothing. The emergency blanket caught the light once, a brief foil glint against the white of the bench, maybe 200 yards out, and then it was gone. The bench was empty. The boulder sat in the snow with the oval of compressed and melted through white around its base, and the line of deep tracks going uphill was already softening at the edges as the new snow fell into the impressions, and in another few hours there would be nothing to indicate that anything had happened on that bench except for the gauze wrappers and the food packaging that we would eventually collect and pack out. All 4 of us stood at the tree line for some time without speaking. I do not know what the others were doing with those minutes, but I know what I was doing, which was standing in the silence of that bench and understanding that I was on the other side of a threshold, that there was a line in my life marked November 16th, 1989, and everything before it was one thing and everything after it was another. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that made my previous life feel wrong or my understanding of the world feel destroyed, more in as certain encounters do when they expand the territory of what you believe to be possible quietly and permanently without requiring you to abandon what you knew before. You just know more now. The map is larger. Roy let out a long breath. Leroy said something I will not repeat. Glenn sat down in the snow where he stood, right there on the bench, put his elbows on his knees, and stared at the ground for a while. After a few minutes, I walked to where it had been sitting. The snow around the boulder was compressed and melted through in a rough oval, the imprint of a large body that had been there for what must have been several hours before we arrived. The gauze packaging from the first aid kit was in the snow beside the boulder. The jerky wrapper and the cracker sleeves, everything we had left had been eaten, including the peanut butter, the foil packet crumpled and pushed into the snow. And on the flat surface of the boulder itself, at about the level where the large figure's left hand had rested during the hours we were with it, there were two parallel lines in the dusting of snow that had settled on the rock. They were not random. They were too deliberate, too even for random, for wind or settling or any incidental cause, whether they were communication or absent gesture or something else entirely, I could not say. I photographed them with the small Kodak camera I carried in my pack for documenting elk sign I wanted to revisit. The photograph came out blurry, as photographs often do when your hands are shaking in the cold, and when I had the roll developed 2 weeks later in Orofino, I studied it under a magnifying glass and concluded that if you did not already know what you were looking at, the image would tell you nothing you could use. I walked back to where Glenn was still sitting in the snow and put my hand on his shoulder. He said, "What do we do?" I said, "I don't know what you do. I know what I'm doing." He said, "What's that?" I said, "I'm going to finish the week's hunt. I'm going to go home and tell Joanne I had a good trip and not elaborate." He said, "That's what I figured." He stood up and brushed the snow off his pants. Then he said, "It was shot. Somebody shot it." I said, "I know." He said, "From the angle and the entry, it was not a hunting accident. It was close range. It was someone who saw what they were shooting at." I said, "Yes." We stood with that for a while in the quiet of the bench. The snow was still falling. The compression ring around the boulder was already softening at its edges as the new snow filled in the contours. I stood there thinking about what the wound meant in terms of sequence, for the figure to have been shot and then to have climbed from wherever the shooting happened to this bench above the tree line. It had to have happened within a manageable distance. Shot animals do not travel uphill for long before the blood loss and the cold and the shock shut the body down. The fact that it had made the bench meant the shot had happened somewhere in the accessible lower elevations, which meant a road or a trail close enough for a person to have reached that country in the daylight hours, which meant it was likely not a random encounter deep in the wilderness. None of us said what we were all thinking, which was that someone had gone looking for it, that the wound was not the product of surprise or panic, the angle of entry that Glenn had described, the close range. These were inconsistent with a startled reaction to an unexpected encounter. A startled person shoots high or wide. A person who has time to take a measured shot at close range is a person who has positioned themselves deliberately and waited. Roy said from the tree line that we should collect our gear and leave. He said it quietly and without emphasis, which was how Roy said things that were not suggestions. He was right. Whatever had happened on the bench with us watching over a long morning had changed the nature of the place for the figure, added us to the inventory of beings it had reason to weigh. The last thing it needed was to return to find us still there. And the last thing we needed was to be present if whoever had shot it came looking to see if the job was finished. We packed up the kit and the thermos and the few items that had come out of our packs. We carried out every wrapper and every gauze package. I filled in the impression our boots had left in the snow as best I could with my gloves, which was pointless given that the tracks behind us going across the bench and into the tree line were unavoidable, but I did it anyway because it felt like the right thing to do. Glenn took one more look at the boulder, at the marks in the snow on its surface, at the compression ring around its base. Then he turned and walked into the tree line, and I followed him. I said, yes. We did not speak much about it for the rest of the week. The week itself was strange in ways that I could not entirely attribute to what had happened on the bench. The forest felt different to us, all four of us, in a way that was not frightening but was altered. We moved through it with more attention than usual, not out of fear, but out of a heightened awareness that what we had assumed was the complete inventory of that country had turned out to be incomplete, and the incompleteness ran in both directions. They were more present than we had known, and we were more visible to them than we had understood. On the evening of the sixth day, sitting around the wood stove in the tent, Leroy said the only thing he said about it for the rest of the trip. He said, you know what bothers me most? I said, what? He said, it was alone up there. He said, whatever happened to put it on that bench, it came through that alone. He said, where was everybody else? Roy said, maybe they could not risk coming. Leroy said, or maybe they did not know. Nobody had an answer to that, and the conversation moved elsewhere and was not revisited. The horses were unsettled the night of the sixth day and the morning of the seventh, not panicked, not in the way they had been on the morning of the bench, but watchful and close-grouped in a way they were not normally close-grouped. I checked the picket lines twice during the night. On the second check, around 2 in the morning, I stood in the cold for a while after confirming the lines were sound, and I listened. The night was still and very cold, -12 by the camp thermometer, and the forest around camp was quiet, with the deep cold quiet I had described, but beneath the quiet, at a frequency I felt more than heard, there was something. A vibration in the air, rhythmic, sustained, distant. I stood for several minutes with it before it stopped, and then I went back into the tent and lay in my sleeping bag and stared at the dark ceiling of the tent and did not sleep for a long time. We finished the hunt, Glenn and I both taking elk on the last 2 days, and we packed out the same way we had packed in, methodically and quietly. The horses were nervous on the pack out in a way they had not been on the walk in, spooky at things along the trail that none of us could see or smell, and I put it down to the same wariness they had shown that first morning at the picket line. On the drive back to Orofino, the four of us in Roy's pickup with the gear in the bed and the temperature down to 15 and the heater running full, Roy said we needed to agree on what we were going to tell people. We agreed on the version that left out the bench above the tree line. We had good hunting, bad weather, good camp. That was the story, and we held to it. The conversation in Roy's pickup on the drive home lasted until we hit the main highway and then died away into the kind of silence that covers things that have been said and do not need to be revisited. We agreed on the story, as I said, but before we agreed on the story, we talked about the other possibilities. Roy asked about an hour out of town what we thought would happen if we told people, not the general public, but specific people. Law enforcement, say, or the Forest Service. I said I did not know, but I had a feeling. Glenn said he had the same feeling. Leroy said he had spent his whole career driving trucks through country managed by federal agencies, and in his experience, the federal government's relationship with things it did not have a category for was to create a category that served whatever the government needed it to serve, and that the category they would create for what we had encountered would not be one that served the figure on the bench or the small one or whatever others were living in those mountains. Nobody argued with that. Glenn asked what we thought the shot had been about, whether it was someone who had encountered it and reacted out of fear or someone who knew what it was and had made a deliberate decision. This question sat in the cab of the truck for a long time. Roy said it did not much matter in terms of what we did with the information we had. Leroy said it mattered in terms of what was out there doing it. Glenn said he thought it was deliberate and he thought it was not a one-time thing. He said a man who shoots something on purpose once will shoot it on purpose again. I did not have a response to that, and neither did Roy or Leroy, and the question went unresolved because it is still unresolved. We had no way to know. We have never had a way to know. Leroy died in 2001, a heart attack at 49 while he was at work at the mill in Pierce. Roy died in 2018, cancer, not long after he retired. Glenn is still alive, living with his daughter in Grangeville, and it was Glenn who called me last spring and said the time had come. I told Joanne that Sunday afternoon in February of 1990. Kevin and Daryl were at a friend's house, and we had the afternoon. And I sat at the kitchen table and told her everything start to finish, the tracks and the smell and the bench and the wound and the 4.5 hours and the sound it made before it walked away. When I was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she said what I have thought about many times since. She said it went to the highest ground it could reach. She said, with a wound like that, carrying the small one, it climbed to the highest defensible position available. She said that is exactly what you would do. She was right. The bench above the tree line, the position against the boulder with its back protected, the sight lines in all directions. It had chosen that ground deliberately, and it had held that ground through the cold and the blood loss, because holding ground was what the situation required. You do not analyze that in a parent. You just do it because the alternative is not acceptable. Joanne is a third grade teacher. She has been a third grade teacher for 34 years, and she is genuinely good at it, which requires a specific kind of intelligence that does not get enough credit. Teaching young children is the act of meeting minds that are still forming and finding the exact way to connect what you know to what they are capable of receiving, and doing it 30 times simultaneously for 9 months at a stretch, year after year, for children who arrive with every variation of home life and preparedness and learning difficulty that the human condition produces. You do not do that for 34 years without developing an exceptionally precise model of how people work, what they need, and how to give them what they need without overwhelming or condescending. Joanne applied all of that to me that Sunday afternoon, which is to say she listened without interrupting and without visibly reacting to the parts that demanded reaction, because she understood that I needed to get through the whole thing before I could start processing any of it. When I was done, she sat with it for a few minutes. She asked one question, which was whether I believed we had done enough. I told her I did not know. I told her we had done what we could with what we had, and that it had been enough for the figure to stand and walk, and I told her about the heat it was generating and what I believed that meant about its ability to sustain itself. She nodded. Then she said the thing about the highest ground, about the boulder and the sight lines and the tactical reasoning behind the position. I had been carrying the image of that bench and that boulder for 3 months by that point, turning it over in my mind from every angle I could find, and what Joanne gave me in that sentence was the angle I had been missing, which was the parental one. I had been looking at it as a tactical decision because I was thinking about it in the frame of things I knew, which was hunting and terrain assessment. Joanne looked at it in the frame of things she knew, which was what a parent does when a child is in danger. The answer was the same from both frames, but the emotional truth of it was different, and the emotional truth of it was what I had been unable to find. Joanne asked if I thought it survived. I told her I did not know for certain. The wound was serious and the cold was serious, and we had only done what we could do with a backcountry first aid kit, but the figure had stood and walked under its own power, covering ground upslope that was not easy ground even for something healthy, and it was generating heat in a way that told me its body was fighting hard and had reserves the cold had not reached. I told Joanne I believed it survived. She said, I hope so. Glenn and I talked about it over the following years, obliquely and infrequently, as men do who have shared something inexplicable in the margins of conversations about other things. We talked about it as men talk about a story that has no frame to put it in, reaching for reference points and finding none adequate. Glenn said once over beers at my shop after hours that he had gone back into that drainage the following November alone without telling anyone. He had hiked to the bench above the tree line and stood there for a while in the early morning light. He had found no evidence he could date to the previous year. The winter had been long and the snow had covered everything. Glenn told me about that return trip on an evening in November of the following year, the month after he had made it. He said he had not told me when he was going because he had not been certain he was going to go, and he had not wanted to explain himself if he decided not to. He drove to the trailhead alone on a Tuesday, a day the mill was closed for maintenance, and packed in a single day, camping that night at our usual spot and making the walk up the north drainage the following morning. He said the bench looked the same in the morning light as it had the year before, the same exposed sweep of wind-scoured ground above the tree line, the same boulder at the uphill end with the same south-facing concavity. He stood in the spot where we had stood and looked at where it had sat. The snow was different from the year before, newer, the accumulated pack of the current season rather than the pack from November of 1989. And there was nothing in it or under it that he could date to our day on the bench. The emergency blanket was gone. Any impression that might have remained from the weight against the boulder had been covered by 11 months of weather. He stood there for about an hour, he said. He was not sure what he was hoping for or expecting. He said it was partly about going back to a place where an important thing had happened to him, as you sometimes need to return to the geography of an important experience to finish processing it, and partly he was curious. He was curious about whether there was any ongoing evidence that the north drainage was being used by whatever used it. He found none on the bench itself. The morning was cold and overcast, and the snow was recent and dry and undisturbed, and the bench gave him nothing. But in the soft ground at the edge of the bench, where the drainage fell away toward the timber below, he had found fresh tracks. Large bipedal pressed into the mud of a thaw that had softened the top 2 inches of soil. 2 sets of tracks, he said, a large set and a smaller set, walking together up the ridge into the high country. I asked him what he thought it meant. He said, "I think it means what it means." He took a drink of his beer and set it down and said, "I think they were fine. I have been back to that country many times since 1989, though age and the knees have slowed me in the last few years." The Clearwater National Forest is close to 1.8 million acres of some of the most remote terrain in the lower 48. And the North Fork country in particular is the kind of wilderness that can hold things that do not want to be found. The Selway Bitterroot Wilderness begins just south of where we were hunting. Another 1.3 million acres of roadless country that runs up against the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness to the east, and together they form one of the largest contiguous wilderness complexes outside of Alaska. Millions of acres where a species could exist in the way that people who take these accounts seriously say this species exists quietly and carefully and well away from the places where humans spend most of their time. I want to tell you about a specific morning in October of 2003, 14 years after the bench, because it is the closest I came to a second encounter in all the years I continued to hunt that country. Kevin, my older boy, was 22 that fall and was hunting with me for the first time as an adult. The first time we had gone in together since he was old enough to carry a rifle and navigate without my help. We were 3 days into an 8-day trip, camped at the same spot Glenn and I had always used, and we had been moving a lot of country with good results in terms of sign and poor results in terms of drawing a shot. On the morning of October 9th, we were working the north drainage, the same one, heading up toward the bench above tree line. At about 6,400 feet, 300 feet below the bench level, Kevin stopped on the trail and held up his hand. I stopped. He pointed at his nose. I smelled it. Not as strong as it had been in November of '89, not the saturating intensity I had encountered that morning, but there, present, the same profile of warmth and earth and wild organism layered in ways that had no equivalent in my catalog of known wildlife. I put my hand on Kevin's shoulder and turned him around, and we walked back down the trail the way we had come, at normal pace, without running, for about a quarter mile. Then I stopped and told him to sit down. He looked at me the way 22-year-olds look at their fathers when they suspect the father is about to say a thing that will require them to revise their understanding of the world. I told him what I smelled. I told him I had smelled it before in this drainage in 1989. He said, Dad, what are you telling me? I told him everything. I had been carrying the story for 14 years without telling my children because I did not know at what age a person is ready to receive a piece of information that will permanently alter their understanding of what the world contains. And I had concluded that 22 and sitting on a trail in the Clearwater with the smell still in the air around us was as ready as Kevin was likely to get. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then he said, And you're sure? I said, Yes. He looked at the trail behind us, uphill in the direction we had come from. He said, Should we go back up? I said, No. I said, We have what we came here for, and what's up there doesn't need us coming into it uninvited. He thought about that. Then he nodded. We made our way back to camp and had lunch and did not discuss it again until that evening when Kevin sat up late with me around the fire after Glenn had gone to bed and asked me to go through the whole thing again from the beginning. I have heard since that November sounds on certain mornings in that country that I cannot attribute to any wildlife I know. Low frequency vocalizations that carry farther than they have any right to carry, that you feel before you hear them, that cut through the sounds of wind and water and settle in your chest like a note from an instrument you have never seen. I have found tracks 3 more times over the years, though none as clear or as fresh as the ones we followed up to the bench in 1989. And I found once in the deep timber in a bowl east of our usual camp a structure that was not built by any human hand and was not constructed by any animal in any behavioral pattern I was familiar with. Branches woven and stacked in a dome shape large enough for something substantial to sit inside, with a door-sized opening facing south and a floor covered in dry needles arranged in layers that had been placed, not scattered. Dry. Warm when I touched the interior walls, built by something that understood construction and understood comfort and understood the value of a dry floor. I went back to the site of that structure 3 years in a row. The first year it was still standing exactly as I had found it, though it had weathered through a winter and the branch weaving on the windward side had loosened somewhat. The second year it had been partially disassembled, the upper section of the dome removed, the flooring disturbed. The third year there was nothing at the original site but about 60 yards upslope and further into the shadow of the mature timber. There was a new structure, different design, lower profile, larger internal volume. The floor material was the same, dry needles laid in parallel rows, but there was also a layer of material I could not immediately identify, a dense, soft material that crumbled when I touched it. I took a small sample and eventually had a botanist I know casually look at it. She identified it as dried sphagnum moss combined with something she called an unidentified fibrous material that was not botanical. She could not say what the non-botanical component was. I could. I photographed it and left it alone, and it was gone the following year. There were other things over the years that I will mention briefly because they belong to the record of that drainage, even if they do not belong to the main story. In the summer of 2007, Kevin and I were doing a scouting trip into the North Drainage, checking water sources and looking at elk sign in preparation for that fall's hunt. We were in the deep timber about a mile below the bench when Kevin stopped and pointed at a tree. It was a Douglas fir, approximately 2.5 feet in diameter, and at a height of roughly 8 feet from the ground, its bark was marked. Not carved, not scratched in the random pattern of a bear marking territory. Marked deliberately with parallel vertical grooves that were spaced evenly and ran from about 7 feet high down to about 5.5 feet, an area of bark that had been cleared of its outer layer in a precise rectangular section approximately 14 inches wide and 30 inches tall. Kevin asked what made it. I said I did not know. He gave me a look that told me he suspected I did know, and I gave him a look that told him to leave it where it was for now. In September of 2011, I was in the Clearwater alone, late in the scouting season, glassing the bench from the timber below. I was there for an hour, not moving, just watching and listening. Midway through that hour, I became aware of a sound coming from the direction of the high ridge above the bench. A vocalization, low and structured, three separate tones in a sequence, with a pause and then the sequence repeated. It was not an elk. It was not a coyote or a wolf or any bird native to that country. I have spent enough time with recordings of known wildlife in that region to be confident of what I am ruling out. The vocalization repeated 5 or 6 times over perhaps 10 minutes and then stopped, and the ridge was quiet, and eventually I walked back down to camp. I have never seen the large figure or the juvenile again after that November morning on the bench. I have never been on the bench and seen anything there that I could attribute to them. But the drainage has continued to hold things that I cannot account for within the standard inventory of north central Idaho wildlife, and I have stopped trying to account for them within that inventory. The accounting is not the point. The point is that the country holds them and that they are careful and that they have been there longer than any of the systems of classification we have built to make sense of the world. I do not know what to tell you about any of this in terms of category or classification because I am a diesel mechanic from Orofino, and the categories available to me are the ones I grew up with: elk and deer and bear and mountain lion and coyote and all the other things I know are out there in that country. There is no category for what I saw on that bench. There is no frame that I can put it in that does not leave parts of it sticking out. I made my peace with that a long time ago. Joanne says some things do not need a category. She says some things are just what they are, and the fact that you cannot name them does not diminish what they were. She is right about this, as she is right about most things. What I know is what I know. On the 16th of November, 1989, in the snow on a high bench in the Clearwater country of north central Idaho, 4 men put down their rifles and used what they had to help something that was hurt. It was injured and cold, and it was holding a small one that needed warmth it could not fully provide, and it could not move from that boulder until it had rested and until the cold had done its work, slowing the bleeding enough to hold. We gave it warm blankets and food, and we sat still, and we did not raise our weapons, and after 4 hours and 23 minutes it stood and it looked at me, and it said something in a language I will never learn, and then it walked up into the high country with the small one against its chest and the emergency blanket still around its shoulders, and it was gone. Glenn found 2 sets of tracks the following year, a large set and a smaller set, walking together up the ridge. That is the end of the story. I am 69 years old, and I have been a father for 35 years, and I understand in my bones why that large figure climbed to the highest ground it could reach with a wound in its side. I understand why it held on through the cold and the blood loss and the impossible difficulty of what the previous hours must have been. I understand why it wrapped itself around that small, warm, living thing and endured. There is only one thing in the world that makes a parent endure the unendurable. And whatever that dark-haired figure on the bench above the Clearwater was, it knew that thing. It knew it the way we know it, all the way down to the bone. I think about the juvenile often, not in a sentimental way, or not only in a sentimental way. I think about it the way I think about things, with ongoing practical implications, like a piece of machinery I worked on once that taught me a principle about engineering that I applied to other problems for the rest of my career. The juvenile on that bench was alive and functional when the large figure walked away with it. By the tracks Glenn found the following year, a large set and a smaller set walking together uphill, it was alive and functional 11 months later. That is the information I have, and it is enough. But I also think about what it is now. 34 years later, a juvenile that was perhaps 2 or 3 years old in 1989 would be 36 or 37 years old today by some accounting. I do not know how to map human developmental timelines onto whatever developmental timeline these beings follow. I do not know if they age on a similar curve to humans or on a compressed one or an extended one. I do not know what 37 means to them in terms of life stage, but I think about that small, fine-haired body that warmed under an orange emergency blanket on a bench in the Clearwater National Forest, and I think about what it became, and I hope it became something that ran in those mountains with whatever version of health and freedom applies to its kind. The large figure I think about differently. I think about it in the same way I think about my father, which is with a specific kind of reverence for competence and a devotion that I could observe without being able to fully replicate. My father knew those mountains and he moved through them with an authority that came from decades of presence and attention, and he transferred that knowledge to me over many years of patient teaching. The large figure on the bench had a knowledge of those mountains that made my father's look like a brief acquaintance. It had chosen the optimal position in an emergency. It had maintained warmth for the juvenile through blood loss and cold. It had assessed us accurately and made the correct decision about us under conditions of extreme stress. And then it had walked away up a ridge in 8-degree air and new snow with a significant chest wound and carried the small one to wherever was safe. I have been a father for 35 years. I have sat up through fevers and driven to emergency rooms and made mistakes and tried to correct them and spent more nights than I can count running the calculation of what I needed to do right now to keep the people I was responsible for safe. I know what that calculation costs. I know the weight of it, the way it is not a burden that you put down, but a condition of being the person you are, of having taken on the responsibility that parents take on. The large figure on that bench knew what I know. It knew it in a body and a mind that were different from mine in ways I cannot enumerate, but the knowing was the same. The calculation was the same. I think about the juvenile often, that small, fine-haired body warming under the emergency blanket, the clench of those small hands on the large figure's forearm, the weak but persistent sounds it made that were answered each time with the same low resonance from the chest of the one holding it. I think about what it took for that large figure to climb as high as it did, wounded, to reach that bench. I think about what made it choose a boulder with his back protected in sight lines in every direction, not instinct, calculation, assessment of terrain, identification of the best available option, execution of a plan under conditions that would have stopped most things. I have thought about these things for 34 years, and I will think about them for however long I have left, and what I come back to every time is simple. Whatever was on that bench was a parent doing what parents do. Everything else is taxonomy, and taxonomy can wait. The Clearwater country is still out there. The North Fork still runs cold and clear in the spring and freezes at its edges in November. The elk still move through those drainages as they always have, following the snow depth and the temperature and the old trails that generations of animals have pressed into the mountain soil. And in the high country above the tree line, on the benches where the wind has its way with the snow and the sight lines go out for miles in every direction, things move. Things that choose their ground carefully and keeps the small ones close and watches the world below with the patience of a thing that has been here longer than any road or survey marker or property line. There is one more thing I want to say before I leave you with the ending, and it is personal in a way that I am not entirely comfortable with, but I think it belongs here. I am 69 years old. Kevin is 44 and teaches high school physics in Boise, and his son, my grandson Eli, is 8 years old and already obsessed with the outdoors the way that a certain kind of boy gets obsessed with them, because the outdoors is the place where the scale of things is honest. A mountain is the size it is. A river runs as fast as it runs. An elk is as heavy as it is, and you find it out when you quarter one and carry it out on your back. Eli has not been into the Clearwater yet, but Kevin has told me it is coming this fall. And I have been thinking about what I will tell him when we are on that trail, and he asks me what is out there. I have been thinking about whether there is an age at which you give a child the full picture of what the world contains, or whether the full picture is arrived at by accumulation, by the gradual addition of experience to experience until the picture you have is large enough to contain the anomalies without those anomalies collapsing everything else. I think it is the second thing. I think you earn the full picture by living in the partial one with honesty and attention. And the additions come when the person is ready for them, which is not a date, you can mark on a calendar, but a condition you recognize when it arrives. Kevin was ready at 22 on a trail in the North Drainage. Eli will be ready when he is ready. I will know when I see it. What I want Eli to understand before any of the specifics is that the honest response to a world that is larger than your understanding of it is not fear and is not denial. It is the same response you bring to any situation where you are confronted with what you did not anticipate and cannot immediately categorize. You stop. You observe. You do not reach for your weapon unless the weapon is genuinely the appropriate tool. And you understand that the category of things that call for the weapon is much smaller than most people have been trained to believe. 4 men put down their rifles on a bench in North Idaho in November of 1989. I was one of them. I do not claim this as heroism. It was not heroism. It was the correct application of judgment to a situation that had no precedent in any of our experience, and we arrived at the correct application because we were paying attention and because one of us stepped in front of a rifle barrel and said the obvious thing, which was that the target was holding a child. I hope they are fine. I believe they are fine. Glenn believes it too. 34 years, and it is the thing we agree on without much discussion. 2 old men who were once younger men who made a choice on a snow-covered bench, and we live with the choice as you live with the best thing you ever did, which is quietly and without regret and with the knowledge that when the moment came, you did not look away. There's a thing that happens in long-term wilderness hunting that I do not know how to put into words exactly, but that every person who has spent serious time in remote country will recognize. You begin to feel the landscape as a whole rather than as a collection of individual elements. The trees stop being individual trees and become a continuous system. The ridges and draws stop being obstacles and become a grammar, a syntax of elevation and exposure that tells you what goes where and why. You stop walking through the country and start thinking in it the way you stop translating when you become fluent in a language and the meaning arrives directly. When you reach that relationship with a piece of ground, the thing that changes most is your relationship to absence. You learn what is normally there, what sounds and signs and movements constitute the baseline, and you become sensitive to deviations from it in a way that is not intellectual. It is more like a vibration in the peripheral nervous system, an alarm that goes off without conscious processing that tells you something is different before you have had time to inventory what. The 5th night before the bench, lying in the sleeping bag in the dark of the wall tent, that alarm went off. The Clearwater had been in the inventory of my nervous system for 20 years at that point. I knew what it sounded like in November at 5,900 feet, and what I was hearing was not that. What I was hearing was a negative, an absence of the particular ambient noise that tells you the forest is populated by its normal residents going about their normal business. That absence meant a presence that the normal residents had noticed and gone quiet around. I have thought about what it would have been like to be on the other side of that 5th night, to be the large figure moving through a country it knew far more thoroughly than I knew it, carrying a small one and a wound and the need to reach a defensible position before the cold and the blood loss made the decision for it. I think about what that night would have been like in terms of perception, the small hours, dark navigated by senses that operated in ranges I cannot access, the cold managed by a physiology built for it, the terrain read not from maps or years of visits, but from a lifetime of inhabiting it. I think about the particular quality of will that it took to keep moving through that night with those disadvantages against it, to keep ascending toward the bench when the body must have been telling it to stop. We talk about the will to survive as if it were specific to humans, as if it were a product of consciousness and self-awareness and the capacity to project a future self into a present crisis and say, that person needs to exist, and I am the only one who can ensure it. But what I saw on that bench tells me that the will is not that specific. It runs in any body that has learned it has something worth protecting. The large figure on the bench had learned this. Whatever it had been before the small one arrived in its life, it was now apparent, and the will that drove it up a ridge in the dark with a wound in its side was not any different in its essential nature from the will that drove me to Orofino General with my son in my arms at 2 in the morning going faster than I should have on those roads. This is what I want to leave you with because it is the cleanest truth I can extract from 34 years of carrying this story. The world is larger and more populated than we have acknowledged, and the beings that share it with us are not diminished by our failure to acknowledge them. They go on. They navigate their difficult nights and their injured mornings and their long recoveries. They keep the small ones warm. They choose the best available ground and they hold it until they can move. And occasionally, by some combination of circumstance and choice that I cannot fully explain, they allow themselves to be seen. When they allow it, the correct response is not the rifle. It is the palm held out flat and the low, clear statement of intention. This is the oldest communication there is. It predates language. It predates fire. It is